So it's very nice to have a chance to talk to Martin Bloom. Martin, I always start by asking how old, in other words, when a person was born and where they were born.
I was actually born in 1952 in Manchester.
What month and day?
I was born in January. I'm a Capricorn, apparently. And when I was 2, I moved away from Manchester. So although I go back from time to time, I don't really have any strong links there anymore.
We learn a lot about people from their ancestry or from their parentage. Some people like to go back a long way, and some don't know much about their ancestors. How far back can you go?
I think a more interesting question is how do people's choices in life, what are the factors that influence them? In some cases it would be their heritage, it would be their upbringing, in some cases their schools. I'm quite a self-reflective person, and as I've looked back over the years, I've looked at some of the key turning points in my life. And what I see is that in every case, however much I've tried to move in certain directions, the actual direction I moved in has been influenced by a series of chance events, chance connections, unconnected, but it had to happen in a certain order for the outcome to be as it was. So in my case, I'm not sure whether or not my origins actually have influenced directly where I've ended up.
I'm sure they haven't directly, but the viewer will find out a certain amount about you from your background, i.e. Let's start with your grandparents. Did you know your grandparents?
I only knew my grandmothers. Both of them died when I was 8 years old. They were both immigrants into the UK.
From
Lithuania. At that time it was Russian. I think it used to swing between Poland and Russia at that period. My grandmother came over in 1890. My father's grandmother, she didn't speak English, she only spoke Russian. Although as she was living in South Wales, that probably was not a constraint not speaking English, because in those days I think Welsh was the main language.
And they were fleeing from something, or?
I think populations have moved constantly in human history. I think there was a large population that were fleeing from persecution or poverty. What was the actual event that made them leave? I have no idea. Although there is a story that they're on their way to America, and that my grandfather actually got to America, but because he was in very poor physical condition, because he refused to eat on the boat, they wouldn't actually let him in, so they sent him back again.
Good heavens. He was starved even more on the way back.
I assume so. I don't know. I never knew him. Both my grandfathers died before I was born.
What did they do? Do you know what their occupations were?
I have no idea whatsoever.
And obviously you didn't know the character of your grandparents, so moving down to your parents, tell me something about them.
My father was from a South Wales town. He moved to London to study medicine. He decided it wasn't for him, so he left that and did a whole range of things. And when I knew him, he was in property, but I suppose in a similar way to myself, he didn't stay at any one thing long, in the sense that he, by chance, became an art collector. Not because he was interested in art, he just got taken by the works of L.S. Lowry, the English painter. He saw a documentary on his on him. In fact, the story as he tells it was that he wanted to listen to the 9 o'clock news one evening, and because he had a tendency to fall asleep, he put the television on early, and it was a documentary by John Reed on L.S. Lowry. And as he saw these images, it reminded him of South Wales, so he got very nostalgic. And just by chance, his one of his business colleagues knew Lowry, so put him in touch, and he commissioned some works of Lowry, and then eventually met him, and they became lifelong friends. They used to go meet once a week. They used to go on holidays together.
Gosh.
My father took him to South Wales on 4 occasions. It was the first time Larry had been there. on one occasion they came across the bridge to Bristol and visited me at Clifton where I was at school.
So you knew Lowry?
Yes, I'd met him quite a few times. He used to come across to tea in Southport, where we lived at that time.
What was he like as a man?
He had a great sense of humour. He was very large, very tall. I saw him as a very jolly fellow. He had a great sense of humour. I think if one looks in the benefit of hindsight, he also had a lot of secrets. There were certain things in his life that people weren't aware of. And he used to keep his friends in different cubicles. So, he saw some people on one day a week, but he saw different people on other days, and he'd never let his friends meet each other.
Interesting. And your father's character, as it might have affected you?
I'm not sure, because I went away to school. Yes. I went to boarding school quite early.
Yeah.
And ended up at Clifton.
At what age did you go to boarding school?
8 years old.
8 years old. But there were holidays and there was the time before, so...
Oh yes, no. I did used to see him from quite a lot, and I had a high regard for him, and we used to keep in touch, and I used to phone him once a day, even when I was in overseas countries. So we were in constant contact.
You were close to him.
Yeah.
And did he put pressure on you to succeed or to be intellectual or anything?
No, I think he just believed of giving me the opportunity to achieve whatever it is I wanted to achieve. And when I left university, I went into Unilever, and he was very happy with that. Right.
And your mother?
She was a very sweet person, a very nice person. She, as many people did in those days, she gave up any thought of a career to bring up a family. So she was always around the house.
And was she putting any pressure on you at all?
Not at all.
Not at all. Just a gentle, nice person.
Yes, she was. Yes.
Was it with any particular enthusiasms or hobbies or anything? Music or painting or anything?
Not that I recall, though.
Were you an only child?
No, I had a sister. She died when she was 49.
Right. What is your earliest memory, your first memory?
I suppose my earliest memory was being in a car, looking out of the window and seeing a railway bridge. That's the earliest thing I remember.
And how old do you think you might have been?
I have no idea. I understand that child development specialists suggest that anything before the age of 5 is wiped from the child's memory. I don't know if that's true or not, but I have no knowledge of when it was my first memory took place.
Yeah, I know books which show that, well, one of them, a wonderful book, Sinister Street by Compton Mackenzie, and his memories are very vivid from the age of 11 months.
Okay.
Everything down to the colour of wallpaper and everything. And they've been checked. So academics tend to come up with ideas.
Do they? Okay. No, but that's the first memory I recall. I also have memories of our garden in Southport, which actually surprised me when I went back there about 40 years later, because I'd always imagined it as this enormous garden which I used to run up and down. But when I went back again, I realised actually it was quite a small garden, and it was actually me who was quite small, which made it look big to me.
Yes. So where you went off to school, you said, when you were 8. Where did you go to school? Boarding school?
It was a local school.
It was a boarding school there?
Yeah, it was. I used to go home at weekends.
In Southport?
No, it was in Formby, actually.
Formby? I had a girlfriend in Formby.
Oh, okay.
I will talk about that later. She probably knew her. And what was that school like?
It was a traditional British boarding school.
Were you unhappy when you went there first, or not?
I think when one goes away at 8 years old, one probably prefer not to be there.
But you're coming back at the weekends.
Yeah, that's right.
And you didn't cry yourself to sleep
No, I didn't. No.
And you weren't bullied, or as you remember?
Not that I remember. No.
And do you remember any of the teachers from that?
Well, I remember some of their faces. I don't remember the names. I'm not very good with names from the past. So.
And were you developing any sort of childhood hobbies? Do you collect anything particularly, or?
Not really. I mean, I used to like writing. I was quite good in English literature, in writing classes. But I don't recall anything specific at that time.
And then you went on to Clifton, you said.
That's right. Yeah.
What was that like?
It was quite a relaxed school. I explored all sorts of different avenues. It was quite a broad education in those days. The one thing I remember in retrospect is that one of my favourite subjects before I went there was history. I used to love history, stories of history. And when I got there, I was told I couldn't do history because they had the streaming in those days. They had two streams, the upper and the lower stream. And I was in the upper stream. And apparently the upper stream didn't do history or geography, so I had to do German and Latin.
Good heavens.
Now, the only reason I mention that is years later, I mean, I used to get very interested in history. I used to read a lot of business histories. Before university, I used to read histories about scientists and people who had been very successful in history. It always fascinated me. And then when I joined Unilever, I started getting interested in business, industrial histories. And then 19 years after my first degree, I got my MSc in the history of science, because I was very interested in the history of science, history of technology. It was only then I remembered, all those years before, that actually history always interested me and that I wasn't allowed to do it at school. So I'm not sure if my life would have been different had I done history at school, because I was so passionate that I probably would have continued and ended up as a historian.
It's very odd. I mean, you're 10 years younger than me, but at my school they had a history sixth, and you could always do history if you want to. I've never heard of a school that doesn't allow students. I've interviewed a lot of historians, and they all did history at A level and so on.
Well, in those days they had these two streams at Clifton, so I'm not sure. I mean, I know what I know. I mean, I don't know whether it was atypical or whether it was just that period of time. But I think streaming in schools is something that had a fashion. I think nowadays people are much broader in their...
Were there any teachers at the school who really inspired you or influenced you? Do you remember?
I think it's more my reading that influenced me, because I like reading about things. So I don't think there were teachers per se that actually had an influence. But one thing I do remember, which actually I didn't realise how special it was at the time, when I was there, we went on a school trip, and it was in 1967. I was 15 years old, and it was actually to Eastern Europe, and especially the Soviet Union. And it was actually the celebration of the 50th anniversary of the Russian Revolution. And in retrospect, I hadn't, at the time I just saw it as another trip. In retrospect, I hadn't really, it seemed a very strange thing for a British public school to send a whole group of children to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the Soviet Revolution, of the Russian Revolution.
It was an odd thing. I mean, I've forgotten when all the Stalin demasking took place, but it was before that, wasn't it? Because
I'm not sure.
We had Hungary and all sorts of things.
Yeah, I'm not sure whether or not Brezhnev or Andropov or one of those people were in power, or even before that. I'm not sure, maybe, because I was too young to understand politics in those days. So.
You didn't feel any kind of link with the fact that you'd come from Eastern Europe?
No, I didn't at the time, but later on in life I began to see some certain connections. So.
You said you were most influenced by your reading. What were you reading? Do you remember at school particularly? Which authors do you?
I don't remember so much authors. I remember, I was always passionate about stories. I suppose the one that sort of sticks in my mind, which as a child, I don't know about most children, but many children probably read, is The Count of Monte Cristo, and those type of things. But very soon I was reading sort of histories of scientists, of Einstein, of various other scientists, and I always found that fascinating to see how lives develop and how choices are made. I'm quite a self-reflective person, so I'm always sort of reviewing where I've come from, how I've developed, what were the key factors at the time, because quite often people forget about what really pushed them in certain directions.
What about other things? I mean, sport? Do you play games?
I wasn't a great sportsman, but in each sport I remember a particular game when I had a particular success. So there was one football game where we were losing 4-0, and then they put me in goal, and then we sort of came back to equal 5 each, because I suddenly found myself in that particular game. I remember a cricket game when I took a particularly difficult catch, and again all these things, certain things stand out, but I wasn't particularly good consistently at sport, but there's always one game, something happened when something exciting.
You quite enjoyed it. You quite enjoyed games.
I wouldn't say I enjoyed it. I'm not a very sporting person, but I play some sports.
What about other kind of hobby pursuits at school? I mean, music, for instance.
I used to play the piano until I was about 16, I think I was, when I gave it up. So I was a pianist. I started learning the clarinet, and also was taught singing, which I wasn't very good at. But I don't think there was, I can't remember a great deal about that period. I mean, as we talk, more and more of it's coming back, but at the time, it didn't seem very important to me.
I mean, since we're on music, do you still like music, or?
No, I like music, but I don't play it at all.
But what sort of music do you like most?
I'm very diverse, so I used to like classical music enormously, but nowadays I tend to like jazz, I like opera, I like avant-garde music, some techno music. So yeah, I have very diverse interests. It's more a question of individual pieces and performers. So in the classical side, I very much like people like Eric Satie. I think he has a certain purity of his geometry of his works. There's a northern Finnish singer I like a lot. She's a Sami singer from northern Lapland. There are a lot of I have very diverse tastes, but there's particular pieces and particular performers that more interest me than just looking at a particular type of music. I've always been very diverse. I've always covered lots of different grounds. I don't concentrate on any one thing. And sometimes it depends on my mood, my emotions. Sometimes some of these fall out of fashion as I get to look at other things.
And what about painting? I know you're interested in painting and photography. Were you doing much of that at school?
I did some painting at school, but I stopped when I had a particular style of painting, and one of the teachers said that I was doing it wrong and painted all over my things to show me how it should be done, and I never painted again.
Good heavens, that's a bad bad story.
But it's the way life goes. I mean,
when you say you didn't paint again, you didn't paint again there, but you painted...
No, I never painted again.
You never painted again?
No. I have no interest in painting. What I do like is, it depends how you define painting. I mean, I'm a photographer, but not in a traditional sense. I don't look to perfectly reproduce what's around me. What I do is to try and reproduce emotion and feeling and movement and texture, things that appeal to me. And an American art historian said to me when he saw my works, he said, "You use a camera like a paintbrush to create works of art, not photographs." So in that sense, I use light to paint. I paint with light. And I'm looking at possibly turning some of my photographs, maybe printing them on metal, maybe in 3 dimensions. But I'm not a traditional painter in that sense.
Did you start photography at school or later?
University. It wasn't as an art form. I actually started photography because it was an aide-memoire. I realized in the early 1970s that I used to often go abroad, whether on holiday or school trips or whatever, and I go to foreign countries, and after a while I couldn't remember, first of all, which countries I'd been to, and secondly what they looked like. And the images I had of foreign countries, I couldn't differentiate which one was which. So I actually started photography when I went on when I got a holiday job in Australia. And I suddenly realized, that I needed to try and remember where I was. So it's really to document my my travels. And that was quite an interesting trip because it was organised by the English-speaking Union and the Australian Department of Vice Chancellors. And it was to try and encourage people to experience what Australia had to offer. And the idea was that maybe some of them might go and live there eventually. But I had a job for 2 months in Sydney. I used to stay in Neutral Bay and get the ferry across to work every morning. And then for a month I got a bus and went from Sydney, Adelaide, and then up to Alice Springs, Darwin, and across to Mount Isa, Townsville, Cairns, Brisbane, Sydney. So I went all the way around half of Australia by bus. And that was a fascinating experience.
How old were you then?
20.
So it was after, sort of a gap year or something?
It was during my last summer vacation at university.
Yeah.
In those days we didn't do gap years. It didn't exist. Some people did leave university and go travelling.
Yeah.
But there wasn't such a concept as a gap year.
Yeah.
I mean, I think in my case I had a gap year or gap 9 months before university.
Yeah.
Because I can't remember if I told you that I'd applied for Cambridge University and I didn't get in, but because of the way the structure led, you had to apply in September, so you lost the rest of that year. So I had 9 months when I was I suppose that was a form of gap year.
Yeah.
And I spent most of it reading, reading, as I say, histories of scientists and biographies and read historical works.
I mean, certainly if you're an Anglican in a boys' boarding school around the age of 15, you're confirmed. Presumably, were you confirmed or not?
I'm not Anglican.
No, I assumed you weren't.
No, I'm Jewish.
Yes.
I'm not practicing, but I actually went to the school I went to at Clifton was a Jewish school, or a Jewish house. But in a sense, that cured me of religion. So I haven't really.
I was going to ask you about religion.
Yeah, I haven't been religious ever since. So.
I mean, were you before, or
not?
were you bar mitzvahed, or?
I was, but I think before a certain age, religion is a habit that's imposed upon children by their parents. I don't think I had any deep spiritual feeling towards any religion at that stage.
But since then you haven't?
No, I mean, I believe there was a creator, but I don't believe any creator would interfere with our lives on a day-to-day basis. I don't think I don't think there would be any need for that.
What leads you to think there was a creator? Intelligent design or something?
Not so much intelligent design. I just feel that this is the most logical thing, that there was some. If the universe wasn't created, or our universe wasn't created, it was spontaneous generation, and the question then is, out of what? So there must have been something beforehand. But it's very difficult for people to understand things outside their own environment. So it's a bit like Plato's cave. If you're looking at the shadows that are being coming into your cave from outside. You have a view of what's out there, but it's very difficult to have a true concept of what's out there unless you actually you actually get outside of that of your cave. So unless we can get out of our own universe, then it's very difficult to understand what's out there.
But the concept of a creator suggests a kind of an agency of a vaguely human kind. In other words, a he or a she or a something.
Not necessarily. I mean,
that's not the kind of creator you were thinking of.
No, I just think it's in our own image. I mean, that's just because we like to personalize things. We like to make them human. I've got no idea what form this intelligence would be, but it's not so much a question of design. It's a question that there seems to be some direction in the development of our own solar system and our own Earth, and and human life or life forms on it. There seems to be a direction that's taking place.
Towards what?
I have no knowledge. I mean, none of us really do, because until we get there, I mean, I don't think many hunters could conceive of an industrial society, let alone a stable agricultural society. So I don't see how we can understand what will happen in the next phase or the phase after.
But what makes you think there's a direction from the past to now?
There's an increasing complexity in our society. As I say, we've moved from a hunting community to an agricultural to industrial. I mean, it's not a direct link, because different societies have developed in different ways, and there are enormous variations. In the same way as in the political world, people talk about the move towards democracy, but democracy means different things to different people. Even in the West, every democracy has a different structure of decision making amongst the people. But there does seem to be a directed move from what was a very primitive society to something more advanced. Now, maybe that's a bit too pompous and arrogant, because some of the early civilizations were very complex and very well developed, and had some thought processes which we could and ideas we could perhaps learn from today. But there does seem to be direction. It's not a linear direction. There's lots of ebbs and flows. I'm very much a believer in non-linear development. But even in chaos theory, there's structure.
So there's structure, and there's increasing complexity.
That's right.
What about death? Does the fact that you don't have any religious belief lead you into any apprehensions or anxieties about death?
I'm a realist. If I die, I die. Now, if there's anything beyond death, then either I will be conscious of it, in which case that will be very positive, or whatever the energy within me that's part of this unified system will go up to something more interesting. But from a personal point of view, I mean, what happens. I mean, there's death all around us. If we were really concerned with death, we probably would, take very different decisions from a political perspective.
Yeah.
Because our politicians don't really concern themselves with whether their actions lead to death and destruction or not. So, I'm human like anybody else. So the fact that the majority of the population may be concerned from a personal perspective, but they're not concerned for other people's welfare.
I think we discussed this before, and I hope you won't mind me asking, but you're clearly very short-sighted. And I've written a book which has a chapter on short-sightedness and its effect, and there's supposed to be the myopic personality. In other words, a child early on develops short-sightedness, and there's often a circle, because then they read a lot, and they're often under the bed clothes at night, etc., and so their short-sightedness gets worse. Among the characteristics of this personality type is that they're not good at games, and they don't really enjoy games because they can't see very well in a game. And they spend a lot of time on their own game.
That's interesting. That would probably summarize my early life. Until I was 5, apparently I was short-sighted, but nobody had noticed it. So it was only when I was 5 I got glasses for the first time. So it may be linked to that. I mean, as you say, I did read a lot when I was younger.
And it makes people quite reflexive and reflecting sort of people.
Well, then you've explained part of my personality that I wasn't aware of the real background to. So,
well,
so thank you very much. I'm understanding myself even better now than I did before I came here.
I'll tell you some nice stories about that later. But let's move on to university. You didn't get into Cambridge.
No, I didn't.
Did you try any other university? Did you try Oxford, or did you just then go to, where did you go?
I had a number of offers. In those days I had, because of the year gap, I'd already got my A-level results. So I had an A and 2 C's, which in 1973 was regarded as quite good. I know educational standards have changed, and therefore that probably would be regarded as a rather poor result, but in those days it was regarded quite well. So I had 5 other offers from all the other applicants. The one I might have gone to was LSE, because that was the top of second on my list. But I got a lot of pressure from my parents against me going there, because for a number of reasons.
This was 1966 or something like that.
Well, 73. Well, I think they were concerned about 2 things. One is that they felt it was too radical. But also, my father had gone up to London to go to university and got distracted by the lifestyle of a large urban city, and maybe they felt that I would also get distracted.
So you went
to Southampton.
Southampton?
Yeah, for my first degree.
Yeah. What was that like? And what did you do? What subjects did you do?
I did economics, but in many ways I would say it was a sort of 3-year gap in my education. I mean, I learned a lot from traditional economics. I mean, but in retrospect, it wasn't very helpful. I probably would have done better going to doing an economics degree that had more business studies, maybe some history in it. But it was a very theoretical, strong mathematical basis. When I joined Unilever, for example, I had to relearn everything I'd ever learned at university on the microeconomics level, because the business world, in terms of markets and market development, worked in a very, very different way from the theoretical approach that I was taught at university.
Right, but you enjoyed it, and you
No, I didn't say I enjoyed it. I said it was a gap. So I mean, it wasn't. I probably didn't enjoy it. I probably would.
Was there anything? I mean, did you get involved in student politics or acting or anything? Nothing.
No.
Just read.
I used to be acting in my first school, but when I went to Clifton, I applied to act, and they said they didn't want to. They said they didn't want me. In fact, they didn't want very many people. It was a very small, closed group of actors, some of whom became professional actors later on in their careers. So, in my early career, when I was very young, I was interested in acting. But I found that, I don't know, for whatever reason, whenever I find a barrier, I just walk away and, do something different. In those days, anyway. Nowadays, I'm less likely to do that.
Have you any friends from either Clifton or from Southampton who you've kept in touch with?
I know one or two people from Clifton. There's someone I know from even before that, who was a neighbour, and he came from Canada to Southport when he was 8 years old, and we went to the same school initially, and we're still in touch. Yeah, he's now retired, so but it's something I can't conceive of. But I'm still in touch with him.
But not the Southampton ones, really. They were
no. For whatever reason, I don't even remember the names of the people I went to. I kept in touch with one of the professors, or one of the lecturers. He actually ended up as a member of Parliament for the Black Country in Birmingham, around there, or just outside Birmingham. which was actually quite interesting because he always came across as someone who was, very left-wing. He sort of lived in a caravan and he had a certain stuff, but he actually became a Conservative MP, and which seemed to be very different from the approach that he had previously. But I haven't seen him for years now.
Tell me about Unilever when you went there and what you did there.
That was very interesting. That was, in many ways, I joined Unilever because it was part of my curiosity. I've always been interested in understand how the world works, which is partly why I'm interested in research. I used to do a lot of analytical research, and my first job in Unilever was on the corporate strategy side. But the reason I joined Unilever was because this idea of being at the centre of a large multinational corporation to understand how things happen in the world. As I say, it was by chance I got there. Originally, I wanted to go to business school. I then had an interview with IBM and they offered me a job in their finance department in Portsmouth. But I said, I was planning to go to business school, and they said, well, don't worry, just let us know when you're here. And on the Saturday, I got my last rejection from business school, because I think in many cases they wanted people who had already got some business experience, so they probably felt I was a bit young. But then on the Monday, when I was about to reply to IBM, I got a letter from Unilever, who I had had an interview with 2 months previously and hadn't heard of since then. They hadn't even sent me a letter saying thank you for coming. I just hadn't heard from them. And then suddenly I got a letter out of the blue saying, we found we have a vacancy. Are you still interested? So I decided to join Unilever rather than IBM. So again, a lot of the decisions one takes in life are sometimes on a very random basis, but it can actually change one's whole direction of one's life. Unilever was very interesting in those days because when I joined, they were the 8th largest company in the world by revenues. When I left, they were down to 11th because we had the oil crisis, which meant all the oil companies had their revenues revalued because of the doubling and then the doubling again of oil prices. But it was still quite a major company, and it's very diverse. I was on the corporate strategy side. I was doing initially a lot of analytical work. But what was very good for me during that period was it wasn't just on the traditional Unilever areas. It wasn't just in food products and personal care products. I was also involved with some of the other divisions. So I was involved with transport, distribution, logistics, warehousing, retailing. And also I developed some techniques which have stood me in good stead throughout my career. I started, in one of my studies, I had to study an area which had no information on it. Nothing had ever been written about it. No, it was freight forwarding. There was no information available. So I actually did it through analogy. I looked at what was happening in international transport and broke it down by different types of transport. And then I looked at the changes that were taking place. And then I looked at what must have been happening in freight forwarding because of the changes in these other areas, whether it's containerization of shipping, the growth of air freight, or whatever. And then I would go and talk to people in the industry and confirm my findings. And I developed various ideas as to how to analyze different industries, different sectors, which in my later career turned out to be very useful because I have to look at a whole range of different industries, sectors and opportunities, often in areas where there is no information because they're new, they're breaking new ground, they're developing new sectors or subsectors in industry, or changing the business models of those industries. So that was very useful to actually develop those sort of techniques.
Well, you mentioned the technique of analogy, which is a very, very powerful one. You could alternatively say you set up a model based on another system and then see whether the model fits in the case you're looking at. Are there any other secret or private techniques you developed?
Yeah, also? It wasn't so much techniques. I as you've quite rightly pointed out, I'm very self-reflective, I'm very analytical, I read a lot and I study a lot. So I was developing some ideas. Well, first of all, I was very interested in systems analysis. I tend to be very visual. And whether or not I was born visual, or whether it's because my father was an art collector and I was brought up with art around me, whatever it was, I have a very visual way of looking at the world. And so I was very interested in systems analysis. But not so much from the mathematical perspective, but just the concept of systems and how they're structured and how they develop. And I started looking at the structure of cells. I started looking at the development. I'm very interested in change. I'm always interested in change, even now. So I was looking at how biological entities develop. And from organic entities, I also started looking at the development of solar systems and so on. And I tried to develop certain ideas that I could bring elsewhere. So I tried to understand how industries develop and evolve, and try to use some of these concepts from biological evolution and the evolution of planetary systems, the development of the chemical elements through time as chemical as the universe expands and develops. And I still use some of those ideas today. I started writing them, but I never actually finished. I got to a certain level, and then when I found what found useful for me, then I didn't pursue it. Or rather, my career then moved in different directions.
With this visualization, you said you started to write it, but were you doing lots of diagrams and plans and
I tend to
draw charts and things?
I tend to draw diagrams in my head. I look at whenever I'm talking to an entrepreneur about a new business opportunity, I'm mapping in my mind the boundaries of what he's talking about, looking at the different elements, looking at the interaction between the components, looking at where the obstacles might be, how you can scale it more quickly. So I do think very visually. I tend not to draw because I don't feel I need to. I have quite a good visual memory, so I keep things, and I look at things visually, and I'm very good at building things up from first principles, at least the first principles that I've developed. So I don't feel the need.
You said the first principles you built up. Are there any other? First, I'm trying to tease out as many methods that you can help us to understand. Are there any other first principles which you think would be very useful for young business people?
I can't. I think a lot depends on individual people, because everybody has a different way of looking at the world. So, for example, I do a lot of entrepreneur mentoring, and a while ago I mentored somebody who was. She's actually a mentor herself, but she'd been an entrepreneur. And I tend to deconstruct people's. I use mind maps quite a lot for those type of things. And I was deconstructing her background and how she got to where she got to. And I discovered that actually 2 events in her life had directed her career choices. One was that she was dyslexic, and secondly that between the age of 8 and 20 she had very little connection with human beings. She was a show jumper, so her major relationship was with her horse. Because that takes an enormous amount of time, and she hadn't realised that, but she agreed that seems to have been why she chose certain career choices. And then I started studying, looking into dyslexia, and I realised quite quickly that many psychologists misunderstand the whole nature. They see it as a flaw that needs to be corrected, whereas it's a different way of processing information. And then I started looking at other things, and if you look at everything from autism to wherever, there are different ways of analysing information that humans have. I've met a number of software developers who are superb with detailed code, but they're not very good with people. And they have a different way of looking at the world. And it made me realise that actually there's no such thing as normality. Psychology is based on that there is a normal person, and psychology can help cure someone who's outside the normal and bring them back to a normal position. But if there is no normal, then it loses all its validity. So coming back to your own question, you're saying, are those things that one can bring to help entrepreneurs? Well, every entrepreneur is different because each one has a different way of thinking. What I do find, though, is, because I read a lot about cognitive psychology, is that, and I've applied that to my own mentoring, is that a lot of entrepreneurs close down the world around them. They have a certain mindset, a certain worldview, and anything outside that they reject, which means that some entrepreneurs are actually quite bad entrepreneurs, because unless they actually just are lucky enough to have the right direction which is going to succeed, because then they just go with it and they make it succeed. But if they're going in the wrong direction, then they're not very good at readjusting to the world around them. Because in many ways, if you look at the difference between Western entrepreneurs and, say, Chinese entrepreneurs, one of the good things about the Chinese is that they don't know what they're not meant to know. They just try everything. They try, and the key is what people will buy, what the customer wants. So there are entrepreneurs I've met who are too focused on, if you like, the product or technology or the service that they're offering, and they assume people will want it because they want to provide it. So I think that's more important than any sort of ways of looking at, any sort of ways of mapping opportunities.
You mentioned the Chinese-European difference. I think you spent time in Japan, didn't you?
Yes, between 1982 and 1996, Japan was my main focus.
So when you bring Japan in, we'll go into Japan more later, but when you bring Japan into that contrast, where do the Japanese lie?
The Japanese actually are very good as a group society when they're moving in the right direction. But as a society, they've had a lot of problems because they had a 10-year depression when you had deflation and there was a lot of problems, which for many of those 10 years they wouldn't admit internally. I think the Japanese are not very entrepreneurial on the whole. They found it very difficult to make independent decisions, but they're very good in terms of where they've got large industrial groups which actually have access to finance, access to the best universities, the best technologies. That gave them an enormous strength over many years. I think what they haven't had is the ability to move, to take advantage of changes in the world. And they've, in many ways, if you look at a company like Sony should have been where Apple is today. They had the Walkman, they had Columbia Records, they had a film studio, so they had the content, they had the hardware, but they didn't understand the consumer. They felt that if they built something that was better technologically, the consumer would want it. Whereas Apple had a very different approach, and they managed to find a way which actually tied in their consumers into a system which was not just about hardware, it was also about managing information, managing audio, managing video. So the Japanese, I think, have lost a lot of what we saw them as having, the uniqueness we saw them having maybe 30 years ago or 20 years ago.
So as entrepreneurs, when compared to the Chinese, they're not as effective, I think.
They're not, because of this hierarchical society. I remember looking at some of the university spin-outs, or at least the universities that were spinning out technologies back probably about 15, 20 years ago. And what was clear is their idea of spinning out was that the professor of the student who had the idea would own the technology, would own the company. So the company that was spun out was actually owned by the professors, not by the person who had the idea.
And this is in Japan? In
Japan. So it's very hierarchical in those days. Now, that is in the core part of the Japanese population. But there are other people who are maybe outsiders who have actually succeeded very well. Satoshi Son, who's of Korean origin in Japan, has actually been very, very successful. He's probably been one of the most successful entrepreneurs anywhere in the world. He, if I remember rightly, he bought ZDNet. He came over to the US. He got involved in a lot of early stage companies. He was one of the early backers of Yahoo. He owned Yahoo Japan. which he developed under license. He also was very active in China. He was a backer of Alibaba. So, I mean, there are some...
But he's Korean.
Well, of Korean origin, which in the Japanese context means that he's an outsider.
Outsider, absolutely.
Yeah.
Probably went to the Korean university or whatever. So, very separate. Interesting. Well, we'll come back to Japan, I hope, later. How long do you stay at Unilever?
I was there 8 years. When I joined, they were the 8th largest company in the world. When I left, they were 11th largest. Actually, what's interesting is if you look back, in those days, even when I left, they were still well ahead of Procter & Gamble and Nestle, who were quite small at the time. Now, all these years later, both Nestle and Procter & Gamble are larger than Unilever in terms of revenue. So, I think but it was a good training ground for me, but I just didn't see the growth, the change that I was looking for. I always liked change. That's why I like technology, and I wanted to get involved in technology from an early stage. Although, strangely enough, I chose Unilever over IBM. So, but whether or not that would have, changed, well, it would have changed my life. But how it would have changed it, I've got no idea.
What happened when you left, and where do you go after?
Well, I did a number of things. I joined a Malaysian company for a year, Sime Darby. I then joined the metal...
In Malaysia?
No, in London.
In London, yeah.
Then I joined a metal and mining consultancy. It was the world's largest metal and mining consultancy in the UK. And that's what took me into Japan for the first time. Again, by chance, it wasn't by choice. I got there and I was on the sort of sales and business development side of the consultancy, and they suggested that most of the people in that position would have one long distance territory as well as some European responsibilities. And there was one person who spoke very good Spanish, and he was handling Latin America. There was someone who was doing Southeast Asia because his wife was Filipino or Malaysian, I can't remember now, but so they said, well, do you want to handle Japan? I said, okay. I mean, I'd never been to Japan, didn't know anything about Japan, but that started a pattern which, I was involved with from 1982 through to 1996. Japan was my main focus in life, in different guises, in different roles. South Korea was a secondary focus, but Japan was my main focus, just because of that single chance event.
So you went through the collapse of the bubble bursting. In 1982 it was still moving ahead.
That's right.
It was about 1988 or 90.
Well, they didn't actually admit it even in 88 or 90. They still were hiding from the truth.
Did you live in Japan for periods, or?
No, I used to go there for about 5 or 6 weeks at a time. I used to go about 2 or 3 times a year.
And did you learn any Japanese? Or?
I did actually, yeah. I spoke some Japanese, which is a lot easier than Mandarin, because it's a monotone language. It's very much like English. Like Latin or German, it has the verbs at the end. So I found it not too difficult to speak it. I couldn't write it, and I wouldn't try and write it. But speaking basic Japanese was not too bad.
And what struck you most, apart from the business spirit, about Japan in those years?
Well, I like Japan. I like Japan, and I'm sorry I haven't been back more frequently since I stopped going. I think there were a number of things. First of all, it was a very well-ordered society. I used to get cultural shock every time I used to come back to the UK, which is strange. Usually you get it the other way around, but I used to get it when I came back, because it's so ordered, so well, everything seems to be in place. They put an enormous amount of emphasis on detail. So in terms of packaging, the way they package things, I used to spend whole afternoons there was a department store for stationery with 3 or 4 different things, and they used to have some of the most immaculately designed, pens and pencils and staplers and folders. It was amazing. I mean, it was just the attention to detail, the design aspects to this. And also some of the older parts of Japan were very attractive as well. So Japan is a fascinating society.
Do you know what the rates of short-sightedness, myopia, are in Japan?
I have no idea whatsoever, but I'm sure you're going to let me know.
70%.
Okay.
When school leavers, at 13, it's about 40 to 50%. By 17, it's about 60%. After university, it's 70% or higher.
Okay, so that makes them very much a sort of a...
Very, very particular attention, both in their art and their microelectronics and so on.
Okay, so
they see the minute.
That's interesting. So are you suggesting then that actually biological factors like this can influence a whole society's development pattern?
Well, they aren't biological in the crude sense.
Well, I mean, short-sightedness. I mean, it's a question of how it came about, but it affects their biology because they can't.
Yes, that's right.
Whether it came about for environmental reasons is a different issue.
Well, I'll talk about it because I don't want to talk too much. But basically, all cultures that read heavily learn Chinese characters, i.e., Singapore, Hong Kong, China, and Japan have rates of myopia more than double European cultures.
Okay.
So it's learning kanji and Chinese characters that
the reason I find
destroys their eyes.
Okay, so then that destroys my interpretation of your comment, because China is a very different society than Japan. It's much less well organised at certain levels.
Yeah.
And the Chinese seem to have less attention to detail. So so maybe it's, I'm drawing too much into too many conclusions out of your suggestion. Your comment.
We'll come back to it because it's a hobby of mine.
One thing that is interesting, though, is looking at how certain things do influence business development or industrial development, because of the complexity of the Japanese character sets and the fact that Japanese typewriters are very complex. It's more like block printing. They have certain characters they bring out and they have to put into the thing and then use. It was because of that the Japanese developed fax machines. They invented them.
And they continue to use them too.
That's right, because what it meant was they could handwrite notes and then just photocopy them across the telephone lines.
That's right.
to their other people. So it was actually a natural. It's much simpler. Whereas in the West, where typing is much easier because we have a smaller character set, there was no incentive to develop a fax machine in the early days, even though we had both the telecoms capabilities and we had the through Xerox we had the photocopying capabilities. So the technology was in the West, but it was the Japanese who put the two together to make something unique.
Yes, well, that is very interesting. You're working in Japan some of the time, but you're also working in Korea and in Chatham House. And in Chatham House, you're working on what?
I spent quite a lot of time at Chatham House. I was involved initially on the international technology policy side, and I was doing various research projects. And one of the projects I got involved with was not a Chatham House project, but it was an OECD project. And that ended up as a book on the industrialization of South Korea, looking over a 25-year period, the growth of the chaebol, where they got their technology from, how effective they've been. It's quite a detailed study. I think one of my main conclusions at the time was one of the major strengths of the chaebol was their vertical integration, the fact that they covered a wide range of they did everything from components all the way through to assembly to the final product.
A company does the whole thing from beginning to end.
That's right. I mean, not necessarily the same company, but the same group. So they have companies that do different parts. And in fact, if you look at the strength of Samsung today, I mean, that is still their strength. If you look at Apple, who are a competitor of Samsung, Apple's iPhone, probably about half the manufacturing cost goes to Samsung. They produce the screen and also the major processor for it. So even today, that vertical integration is such that even companies they're competing with have to buy components from them, which shows their strength.
How is that different from Japan? Because they have that system of infeudation, as it were, sort of bringing in components when they're needed, and not having large stockpiles and so on and so on. But a single company like Sony doesn't have vertical integration.
I think many Japanese companies used to try, but I think with the changes that took place, they've sort of lost that ability. Also, I think in the semiconductor industry, at one stage the Japanese were very strong in semiconductors, but I think the Koreans just pumped so much money into the industry that each generation required $1 billion or more than the previous generation to actually build the manufacturing plant. So within a very short time, the Japanese couldn't keep up, because the difference between Korea and Japan is, in Japan there's probably, there were a wider range of keiretsu, of industrial groups. It used to be the Zaibatsu and became the keiretsu after MacArthur's reorganization of the industry.
Yeah.
In fact, what's very interesting is he actually strengthened them, because before they were based on the trading companies, he reorganized them around the banks. So the Japanese banks would then get money from the World Bank and others, and or from the government, and they would just feed it down into the different groups. But in Japan, there are many more industrial groups in each sector than in Korea. So in Korea, they can sort of concentrate the activity into just one of two groups. Because one of the approaches of President Park when he was president was to actually he would allow maybe 2, maybe 3 chaebol to operate in certain industries, but he would ban all the others from getting involved in that industry. So there's much more concentration in different industrial sectors.
I see, because I was puzzled, because Japan had plenty of money and MITI was very concerned with.
They were, yeah.
But even so, they couldn't keep up with.
But there's an interesting thing in MITI, which you may not be aware of, is I remember, because I used to get involved with a UK Japanese government group that actually created a high-tech forum, bringing together senior R&D directors of Japanese companies with their British counterparts. And I remember talking to one of the MITI people, became a friend of mine, and we were talking about his background. And I asked him what he did at university. He said, I did Marxist economics. And I did some investigation, and I found that actually, rather than the Western economics that I had been forced to learn, which wasn't very helpful when I joined Unilever, in Japan, many of the government people had done Marxist economics, which has a very different perspective and a different sort of, and it believed in the development of nations, and it has a very different sort of understanding. So it was fascinating.
More applied than theoretical.
Yes, yeah.
That's interesting. Yes. Are there any other factors about Korea that you think contributed to its astronomical success?
I'm sure there were.
Family systems or Christianization or...
Well, actually, the one thing that sticks in my mind, again coming back to Samsung, what people forget is that before the Civil War and before the American involvement in the Korean War and the British involvement, Korea was a Japanese colony for many, many years.
Yes.
And the Japanese used to bring in certain Koreans to work in some of the key positions. So the founder of Samsung used to work in the police force under Japanese instruction, and he developed, and he became very much very close to the Japanese, and he used to spend half his time. He lived half his time every year in Tokyo. And he was very much a believer in Japanese technology and Japanese industrial systems. So I think in many ways the Japanese were the models that some of the Koreans took rather than the Americans. Now what was also very interesting is that Japanese were the Koreans were very keen to industrialize and move up the value chain. The Japanese didn't want them to. So even when the Japanese had products assembled in Korea, they were very careful which products and how much they would allow the Korean. So for example, in the cameras, the shutter mechanism was the key component, and it's very complex. And the Koreans wanted to assemble those because they wanted to learn how to make a camera. But the Japanese wouldn't let them. They would only give them the full shutter mechanism and get them to assemble everything around that. Now the Americans, I mean, the reason the Koreans were so successful was the competition between Japan and America in technology in that period. So both the Japanese and the Americans would outsource some of their production to Korea to bring down their costs, so to enable them to compete with each other. Now, as I say, the Japanese were more controlling in terms of what they were allowing the Koreans to do. The Americans were the opposite. They were much more relaxed because they had the view is that this is a small, this is an Asian country. They can never compete with us. We can always get ahead of them. So that even if they take over the lower part, it's a bit like the Americans in competition with the Japanese. They never really concerned themselves that the Japanese were making low-end products, because for them, that was not important. They didn't realize that was the way of moving up, and little by little they would move up the chain. So the Americans were much more relaxed about sharing technology and techniques with the Koreans. So little by little the Koreans sort of moved up the chain and threw enormous sums of money at it.
And will they continue to be successful, do you think?
I can't see any reason why they shouldn't be. I mean, if you look at the sort of areas that Samsung were very active in, they I can't see them. I mean, everything's relative. As we've seen with Japan, decline can take many generations. Sony is still a major company in the through their Sony PlayStation. They're very dominant in the games market. They're making some very good cameras again. They're still quite strong. They are not the dominant force they once were. So even if Samsung does go through a decline, it's not going to collapse. At the moment, it's looking very strong, and it looks as if it will remain that way. But the reason I'm hesitant is that if you look at the history of technology, I mean, we don't yet know which technologies will drive the industries of the future. We know the internet and e-commerce is very important, but there will be certain technologies, whether it's certain nanotechnologies, whether it's certain types of components, that will be important, but we don't really know what they are. In the same way as when the transistor came out, I mean, it was just seen as quite a small. It wasn't very important. When I think it was Texas Instruments, or maybe someone else, who licensed the transistor technology to the Japanese. Actually, no, it wasn't Texas Instruments. It was another company, I think, from. I think it was another company, but anyway, whoever it was, they only saw the application of transistors for hearing aids. And the Japanese saw it very differently. They saw the opportunity of powering initially wireless receivers. So there's the radios. I mean, I think Sony brought out one of the first transistorized radios. So we don't really know which technologies, which components could have the impact in the future.
But presumably one of the skills you try and develop is precisely trying to guess, or at least to increase the probabilities of knowing which are the technologies which will be successful. Are there any method you use in trying to kind of delimit the alternatives anyway?
I think, let us look at renewable energy, which is an area I've got involved with in the last 8 or 9 years. If you go back to 2006, when I first got involved, at that time there were a whole range of different renewables. There was solar PV, solar thermal, thin films, there was wind, there was wave, there was biofuels, biodiesel, there was hydro. There's a whole range of these renewable technologies. At the time, nobody knew which one was going to win out, and people were putting money into different ones based on a whole range of different factors. At the end of the day, there were only two that really became important over that period. One was solar PV and the other was wind.
What's solar PV?
Photovoltaics.
Oh, yes.
And one of the reasons that became important is not just because of government subsidies, but also the collapse in the price of polysilicon as manufacturing technologies enabled the silicon. Well, actually, partly it was economics. They had to do because the market collapsed when the Spanish withdrew their feed-in tariffs. So that created enormous overcapacity. So it drove down the price. But what was interesting is that the manufacturing capability, silicon could be produced more and more cheaply because of the nature of the material. Whereas other things didn't have the capacity to reduce the cost of the technology. So, but even there, you had those two renewables suddenly coming to the forefront, but then suddenly from nowhere you had shale gas and shale oil in the US suddenly coming from nowhere to becoming such a dominant position in American energy resources. So if you go to the next 8 or 9 years, I don't think anybody can see what it will bring. In my own case, I'm very much interested in hybrid power, especially off-grid hybrid power, because large parts of the world don't have a ubiquitous grid. In the UK, we have a national grid, but many countries don't because the size of the country is much bigger. The population is more disparate. Countries like India, many African countries, in Indonesia. So I think what's for me is interesting is off-grid power, and I think a lot of those will be hybrids between maybe solar and lithium-ion batteries, or solar and wind, or whatever. But nobody has yet worked out which combination will be the one that wins out. So I think it's a bit like many things. People exploring different opportunities. So what I know is, the important thing is I know what the questions I should be asking when I'm looking at these. I don't always know the answers. But if you don't ask the right questions, then you will never, get the answers. Some people are asking the wrong questions, and therefore they're getting.
Give me an example of 2 or 3 questions you should always ask.
Well, I suppose a number of things. I mean, if you look at technologies coming out of this university, I mean, a lot of them in the labs you can do certain things, and therefore you can prove certain things can be done. What you can't prove is if you scale up to a industrial scale production system, a production unit, will the efficiency remain, and will the cost of production or whatever it is you're doing remain? Now, usually you go through a pilot scheme where you build something much bigger than the laboratory scale, and then you go to something that is industrial scale. It's very difficult to actually work that out, but you have to ask yourself, what is required in getting there. Quite often people who've developed a technology in the university, they have an inherent confidence in what their technology can do. But so often, when they actually start to scale up, it doesn't actually succeed for various reasons. It could be the efficiency, it could be a whole range of things. So you need to ask yourself what is required in scaling up. The other thing is also what else is happening around the world. What else is being developed? Because every time I talk to people who developed a technology or a product, in most cases they're not really aware of what else is out there, because they say, well, this is the one. They're so bound up in it that they believe that what they're doing is the one that will succeed. Therefore, they close their eyes to what is happening elsewhere. So one needs to try and get a more lateral view to try and understand what else is happening out there, what other technologies, what other approaches. Sometimes business models are very complex. I saw something recently where someone was developing something which would revolutionize a particular industry. But actually the part that was most important was not the thing they were producing. But they felt that what they were producing would have to be in every deployment of this, because it was better and it would solve problems which actually were not the main problem. And if you look at the third component, which was not under their control, that was the one that actually could provide a service which people would pay for, irrespective of what they were doing. So it's there's a number of elements. And as I say, I tend to map out the boundaries of an opportunity, look at the different parts of it, look at different ways of deploying it, look at where the obstacles are, look at alternative approaches. One thing I found very interesting in with many technologies is that most technologies have multiple applications in completely different sectors. But quite often, the first thing that a technologist will do is they'll bring in a business person to advise them, someone who's commercial. Usually that's from their environment that they're involved with, whether it's geographical or whatever. And those people will have experience in certain industries, certain sectors. And once they start getting involved, they will say, "Oh, you need to, that could be used in these sectors because I know because I've been working in that area. So you ought to try and apply it there." And once you start moving down a certain trajectory, it's very difficult to move from there. And it could be quite often that the best application is something that is actually somewhere completely different. Because quite often, multiple technologies are all applied for the same applications, because that's where the people who are involved in the commercialization of those technologies are from. So you get too many technologies all moving into the same area, whereas sometimes the best opportunities are in areas which are outside, which may or may not be bigger, but even if they're not bigger, they may be more easier for technology to address because there are less people applying themselves in that area.
I was wondering, about 4 or 5 years ago, I interviewed, more or less the same time, Sir Richard Friend and Herman Hauser, and Herman showed me plastic logic, and he raised a lot of money for this idea of a plastic kind of iPad thing. And
some of it came from me.
Did it? Oh.
I was an investor there.
Well, and Richard, who had helped in the development of LEDs, was telling me about the fantastic possibilities of reversing the process. In other words, using a non-silicone system to trap sunlight, and a small American state could supply the whole world. I got very excited and told all my friends that we didn't worry anymore. But since then, things have gone rather quiet, and I wondered what had happened in that case. I mean, was that a case of a university development which looked very exciting in a laboratory, but once you tried to make it in scale, it didn't take off?
I think if you go back to the 1850s, 1860s, technologies used to be promoted by industrialists, and they were called promoters. I think that's still the case today. People promote things for reasons that don't always lead to the end result that you would like. I think what you're referring to in the solar side is thin films.
Yes,
and there are a whole range of thin films. I don't know if you remember back, I think it was 30 or 40 years ago, people said that silicon for semiconductors were finished. It was going to be, semiconductors would be using gallium arsenide and Josephson junctions. And what happened was that gallium arsenide was fine for semiconductors that needed, needed certain functionality, but they were too expensive for most use. So they were used in the space program and various other things. When I first got involved with the solar industry, everybody said, "Well, why are you getting involved in solar PV, photovoltaics? Silicon for solar is finished. It's going to be thin films using gallium arsenide and various other materials." And I suddenly remembered this history, and I thought, I've heard this before somewhere. So yes, a lot of people had a lot of belief that thin films was the way forward. It was new technology, and it's going to change the world. Now, thin films have some role in the world. They're being sold. Some companies are doing very well out of it, but it's not yet ubiquitous. It's not yet at a cost that is actually and efficiency which is comparable with silicon. So maybe I think what happened with the declining price of polysilicon, which actually brought down the cost of solar photovoltaics using silicon, pushed out the possibility of thin films by another 10 years or so. So it'll take time. I'm not saying it'll never come, but at the moment it's not a technology to back for the immediate future.
More recently, you've been involved a lot in China, haven't you?
I have, yes.
I know that my colleague Zilan Wang is going to talk to you about China too, but I'd like to include it in this section. When did you first go to China?
Okay, well, what I should point out is that I think I mentioned right at the very beginning, every key turning point in my life has been through a series of chance meetings, chance events are conducted, but which had to happen in a certain order. In 2001, Lord Sainsbury, when he was Science and Innovation Minister, was approached by the Chinese Minister of Science and Technology. And there was a meeting between the two delegations, and I was one of 4 outside people invited to that meeting. And basically what had happened is in 1998, 1999, the Chinese ministry, on behalf of the Chinese government, had put money into regional funds in China. And the remit of those funds was to seed venture capital companies in the major universities, science parks and incubators. And there were 2 roles. One was to accelerate the growth of technology from those bodies, and secondly was to create a venture capital community. It was quite innovative, actually. And then in 2001 they'd made their first investments, and the question is, where did they go from here? Now, in those days we were number 2 in the world in venture capital, and we were quite innovative. So they wanted to learn from best practice ideas. So they visited Los Angeles to set up a joint working group and there was a number of other initiatives that came out of that first meeting. And through various routes I was involved in several of those, and that culminated in 2005 when I was appointed UK chairman of the China-UK Venture Capital Joint Working Group to foster collaboration in venture capital between China and the UK. And our first meeting was launched by Gordon Brown when he was in Beijing. So, little by little I got more absorbed into China. I think if you look at a lot of my career, whether it's Japan, whether it's China, whatever it is, I have a very addictive personality. So when I get involved with things, I sort of tend to get, can't give it up, and I get more and more involved, more deeply involved, and when I do it, I want to do more of it. So very soon I was spending a quarter of my time in China. And one thing led to another. And through that joint working group, and also through the World Economic Forum, who had a group looking at private equity and venture capital, one in China, one in India. But through those, which I was asked to join, I got to know a lot of the VCs and private equity groups in China, both the domestic and the foreign ones, the Americans, Singaporeans, Taiwanese, and Europeans. And in fact, I got quite well known in China to such an extent that in 2007, I was on a Chinese delegation to Silicon Valley, representing the Chinese. So it's just interesting the way life goes.
Mm.
And the highlight was a private dinner with Al Gore, hosted by John Doe of Kleiner Perkins. And at that, he announced his new China fund, which turned out to be the people from Venture TDF in Shanghai, who I already knew. So everything was all connected. But in 2006, in between those two, in between becoming UK chairman of the Joint Working Group and going on that visit to Silicon Valley with the Chinese delegation, I went over to China with the Lord Mayor of London, Sir David Brewer. I went with him twice. And the remit was to promote the London Stock Exchange and AIM. And at the time, the London Stock Exchange wanted to get more Chinese companies onto AIM. And so because of that, I was approached by a number of companies wanting help listing on AIM. And I looked at all these companies, and I actually said no to all except for one small company. The company at the time was 9 months old. The first year revenues actually turned out to be only $5 million. But for whatever reason, I liked the people, I liked their approach to listing, I liked their business model was very innovative at the time. And it was in a sector that sounded interesting, although I didn't know very much about it. It's the solar industry. So I joined the board, helped them list on AIM on the 8th of August 2006, a very auspicious day in Chinese, the 8th of the 8th.
Mm.
In September that year I became chairman. A couple of years later we listed on the New York Stock Exchange, we got our dual listing. And now we're purely on the New York Stock Exchange. And in 5 years, those $5 million revenues had exceeded $1 billion. It's very high growth.
What is the... It's solar energy, is it?
Yes, it's a solar energy company. We're now the 5th largest in the world. And last year we increased revenues by a further almost $600 million. So, it's been a very interesting period. It's a Chinese company. Everything about it's Chinese apart from me. So I've seen a lot of. Plus, I've also was very much involved with the UK government activities. So I've seen a lot of sides of China, and built up a strong network. And it's been a fascinating time in the growth of China. I mean, I think when I first started going, what I found very worrying is that very few people in the West, in the UK or even the US, but were interested. They asked me, why are you going to China? What's in China? Why aren't you here in the UK? I mean, I think they thought I had a girlfriend there or something. Whatever it was, I mean, they just didn't understand what it was about China.
Mm.
And then when they began to understand, they said, "Oh, it'll never last. It'll collapse." And then, then when they saw that it was continuing, they said, "Oh, you can't make money in China. They're not. They'll steal your technology or whatever." There was always a reason why they didn't want to engage with China, but in fact, we can't afford not to. As you know from one of the poems I wrote, because I also write poetry, this is if we don't embrace China, China will be over here soon. I mean, the Chinese companies are internationalizing. People like Alibaba are, it's going to be the biggest IPO on the New York Stock Exchange, far in excess of the size of Facebook and Amazon and Google all combined. These are very major corporations, which have almost been ignored by the West.
And do you think that continues, this ignoring, or has it got changed in the...
Well, I think China itself is changing. Therefore, some of the opportunities are more difficult to embrace because it's the same in the US. Once you've got the Microsoft, the Googles, the Amazons, all those companies. Once they're established and large, and they dominate certain industry sectors, it's very difficult to compete against them.
Mm.
So I think there are opportunities in China. But they're getting more and more difficult for us to find because there are a lot of Chinese also looking for the same opportunities, and they make very aggressive business people. They're very good, very entrepreneurial, very commercial, and strong
and
competitors.
trustworthy.
They're as trustworthy as anywhere else in the world. If you read some of the book about Jeff Bezos and Amazon, I mean.
Mm.
Well, how does one define trust in business? Many people see business as a competitive thing, which anything goes that's legal.
Mm. As you said, a number of people say, "Oh, well, it's just a short-term phenomenon, and it's the bubble will burst shortly," and so on and so on. What's your feeling about? Because the other prediction, if you look at the graphs, and the graph I give in my little book, which shows car production, for example, and car use in China, which will be double that of America within 15 years, and the Chinese economy is predicted to double the American economy within 20 years, etc. But people say, no, of course it can't happen. What's your feeling?
First of all, we seem to have a very selective view. I mean, if you look at the problems of continental Europe at the moment and over the last 10 years, or at least certainly since 2008, and also the problems of America from 2008, which they seem to be getting over but were quite significant at the time, is it for us to say, can Chinese growth continue? I mean, we've got such problems of our own, economically, industrially, that nothing is linear. So I mean, there will be ups and downs in Chinese development, as in any country, but it's going in a direction which is going to be very difficult to deflect. So I actually think the problem is, how are we going to revitalize our own economies? How are we going to revitalize our own industries? Not whether or not China can continue to be a powerhouse.
I had a discussion with someone who was most famous Indian economist, Amartya Sen, and he works in China a lot. So I asked him to compare the two cases, because some people said India is going to overtake China soon and so on, and he was just amazed that anyone could have such a view. Now, you mentioned India, and you must have been there and looked at it a bit. What is your feeling about the comparative power of the two economies?
I've been involved with India since the beginning of my career. My first role in Unilever was working with Hindustan Lever, which was then the largest private company in India. India has a lot of problems. In a way, it has a British colonial structure, administrative structure, on which they've embedded their sort of caste hierarchies. Indira Gandhi developed a Soviet 5-year planning system, which, although they've disbanded what they call the License Raj, it still has, the thinking is still there. Until the present government, the previous government didn't believe that government should intervene for industrial development. I had a meeting with Dr. Montek Alawalia, who was number 3 in the last government, the deputy head of the Planning Commission, but ex-World Bank, and his view is that the government's role wasn't to intervene to help develop the economy. So I don't think the present government came on board with the promise to modernise and to move things forward, and certainly the Premier in his previous role had actually modernised the state and made things happen. The question is whether or not there's too much inertia in the economy, in the society, to make that happen. But they've got a long way to go. For whatever reason, I mean, don't forget, Chinese development hasn't just been overnight. It's been a 20 or more year phenomenon. Although in the last 10 years it's accelerated, but and it's been based on urbanization and rebuilding and infrastructure, and a whole range of other things starting from that. India is still very much an agricultural economy. It's also very slow moving. They have something like 3 million elected representatives at national, at state, at city, at village level. So it's very slow moving. The other thing also is that I think they say by 2030, India will have a larger population than China. But in the Indian context, I'm not sure it'll be a positive. I think it'll be a constraint, because. But we'll see. I mean, India has potential, but I haven't seen any evidence that it will reach that potential. I think it's just too complex. So one has to admire China for what it's achieved, given the size of the the problem that faced it. But they have got to they've achieved great things in the last 20 or 30 years.
And then coming back, you said that you are now going to spend more time in this country because you think there are big potentials here. What sort of thing are you hoping to devote your energies and time to?
I think there are a number of things. First of all, I think I still will need to travel, and it doesn't mean to say I won't be involved with China or any other country. But a lot of, if you take the Chinese companies I'm involved with, we're becoming more international. So a lot of the activities are outside China anyway. Britain is still a very important centre for project finance, for projects all over the world. It's a very important centre for development of technology, of e-commerce platforms. So there's a lot of opportunities over here. But I think also I'm just going through a period where my own life goes through a transition. Because since 1982, I've been travelling almost constantly. I spent probably a quarter of my time overseas throughout that period. Initially it was Japan and Korea, to a lesser extent Taiwan, but mostly Japan. Then it was UK and US, between 97 and 2002, and since then it was mostly China, let's just say India, and some other countries as well. I just feel, for whatever reason, that that London is calling. I mean, people often say to me, if I was to think of anywhere in the world I would want to live, which city of the world would I want to live at? And now I've answered my own question, having spent a lot of time travelling the world and being involved in other cultures and other countries. I see London has great opportunities even today. And although it's always very dangerous to make forecasts, I mean, I've said for over 6 months now, it's not inconceivable that we could have an independent Scotland within the European Union and the rest of the United Kingdom outside the European Union. The whole world is changing, and it's a much more dangerous place than it's been since the mid 20th century, I think. So maybe that's also leading me to make decisions. But we're in a very, very unstable environment, and decisions have been taken by politicians which are, in retrospect, will be seen as irresponsible, because the decisions they're taking don't meet the objectives they claim to be trying to meet.
I want to ask you, I know you're a Cambridge angel. In other words, you help fund startups and things like this, or be involved in advising them. Just to say something about the Cambridge phenomenon, I mean, why do you think it occurred, and how important is it, and what is its nature?
Well, why it occurred is a historical factor. I mean, some people say it's because it's the great ability of the people in Cambridge and the academics and so on. But in fact, it's more. It was a series of events. I think one of the one of the first technology companies that set up in the area was Pi, and then it became Plessy, and then Philips, and then developed from there. But also there was a series of technology consultancies that were created, which were people who had been educated at the university. They were technologists or computer scientists or whatever, such as Cambridge Consultants, the Technology Partnerships, TTP, Sygentia, and so on and so forth. And I think a lot of that provided enormous strength for the whole Cambridge phenomenon. A lot of the initial, or quite a few of the initial spin-outs came out of those bodies. I mean, the whole printing value chain, from Domino Printing and all those sort of companies, came out of Cambridge Consultants. So I think that was the strength that people often forget. The fact that there were these people whose role it was to try and help other companies commercialize their technologies, or develop products based on their technologies, or to find technologies which would enable them to produce certain products. And that was a very important platform. And I think those companies are still quite important. The university is obviously quite important, but I'm not sure that many of the major technology companies created in Cambridge, I don't think many of them can be attributed directly to the university. Whereas I think some people see the Cambridge phenomenon in terms of the university, but it's not. Also, in many cases, or in some cases anyway, that some of the biggest companies are not really funded through traditional routes, through the angels, venture companies, and so on. So, for example, ARM, which is probably the most successful Cambridge company, it was created. It came out of Herman Hauser's Acorn, but it was actually spun out as a joint venture with Apple, which people often forget. And that is, the most successful company in Cambridge. So there are lots of different routes, but I think but I think when you get to a certain level, then things start to reinforce each other. So the fact there is a cluster of companies in both the physical, the electronic sciences, as well as in the biosciences, means that there's a lot of people being trained within those companies, learned from those companies, who are moving to other companies, and therefore they're helping the startups. There are entrepreneurs who have sold their companies who are now reinvesting in new companies. Plus there are some companies that are still very active. So I think it's a very complex thing. It's a historical thing. I think now it's been created, it will remain, because there is a certain level of capability, which is in terms of both the funding sources. People are now looking to put money into Cambridge companies because people are seeing what's been occurred here. There are a lot of people with scientific and technological abilities that are coming out of the university or coming from elsewhere to here because of the Cambridge. Cambridge is now a brand, in effect. It's very important in that sense. Plus, as I say, there are a lot of entrepreneurs who are being recycled and are building new companies, having built others. So I think once you get to a certain stage, you get a tipping point, and Cambridge has long since passed that tipping point and has created something which is sustainable.
Excellent. Well, we're just coming to the end. Was there, and we haven't touched on your poetry, we touched on your photography in a minor way, but was there anything else that you really would have liked me to ask you about, your personal family, for example? Or
I'm not sure. I mean,
are you married? Or
I am married, but I'm just trying to think what else there is that is relevant to this particular discussion. I think the main thing I would just re-stress again, which I think I mentioned once or twice, is that my life has not been planned. I don't know. You've interviewed a lot of scientists, and it may be that some of those hadn't planned their careers, but quite often when you move into science, you stay in the science for the rest of your life in your particular science, or maybe, although some sciences are platforms for other things like mathematics and maybe chemistry. But in my own case, I've sort of, in a sense, I won't say I've recreated myself, but life has recreated me in different ways in different stages of my career. So I think that's very, very important, because I do a lot of entrepreneur mentoring, but I also get people wanting to advise them on careers, what they should do. Well, I mean, it's very difficult, because when I was younger, I actually believed in planning. I believe you could plan the future. I believe if you had enough information, you could actually determine what you could forecast the future if you just had that little bit more information. But I now realise that actually, you can't do that, and I've actually stopped trying to plan. I try and determine which directions I'd like to go in and the parameters around it, but I have no idea where I will be in 5 years' time or 10 years' time. I'm sure if you were doing this interview as a follow-up in 5 or 10 years' time, you would find that neither of us could anticipate where I've ended up.
Maybe we will. Thank you very much indeed, Martin.
My pleasure.